name is Karen Smith. I'm a professor of international relations at the LSE, and I also, for my sins, am head of department, which is just wonderful during a pandemic. But I'm delighted actually to be able to be here and to be able to talk about something other than administrative tasks. So this session on need for women-led diplomacy for a new world order. I always wonder if there should be a question mark at the end of that, but we can discuss that, and the panelists can discuss that. So I'm delighted that we've got three very experienced and knowledgeable panelists to share their thoughts with you on this particular topic. First up, we have Dame Judith Macgregor, who is a British diplomat who served as High Commissioner to South Africa, Ambassador to Slovakia, and Ambassador to Mexico. And I noticed also from your FCO or Gov page that you also served as President of the FCO Women's Association in the past. Next up, we then have Roberta Guerrina, who is professor in the School of Sociology, Politics, and International Studies at the University of Bristol. She's written extensively on EU gender politics and policies, including EU foreign relations and also Brexit. She's the go-to person on how Brexit has affected women. Then third up is Henriette Müller, who is a visiting assistant professor of leadership studies at NYU Abu Dhabi. And she recently published a book entitled Political Leadership and the European Commission Presidency. So three very distinguished speakers, and we will go in the order that I just introduced them. Each panelist is going to speak for about 7 to 10 minutes, then we'll launch a discussion, and the audience can submit questions via the Q&A function, and then I'll kind of select a few questions. I'll group the questions, I think, rather than take one at a time, and we'll see where we are by 15:25 UK time, whatever time that is where you are, 25 minutes past the hour. So I'm delighted to launch this session now, and over to you, Judith.
Thank you very much. I haven't had, unfortunately, the chance to look at the rest of the sort of, to attend any of the other talks, but just two introductory comments before I get going on women in British diplomacy, but diplomacy more widely. Firstly is that I think to achieve the vision that this whole conference is looking at, we're going to need diversity in every shape and form coming into diplomatic and other international organizations, not just female diversity. And secondly, I note that last weekend, of course, we had the G7 summit, which broadly, I think, exemplified the resilience of that forum and a renewed commitment by the democratic nations involved to come together to look at the big world issues. And of course, we have G20 coming up and COP26. So within that general sort of broad framework, I mean, there is, I think, some welcome movement, perhaps, at international dialogue. Now let's come on to the role of women. So I'm a British diplomat, and as you heard, I served in several places. My husband was also a British diplomat, and we were ambassadors together at one time. It was not an easy journey. I think the path to female leadership in diplomatic services around the world has been uneven and probably has accelerated quite considerably in the last decade. When the doors opened in the UK in 1946 after the Second World War, but until 1973, women had to resign on marriage. So when I joined in 1974, basically there weren't many women around, and there certainly weren't any obviously married women or women with families. And it took time for a senior female cadre to develop, therefore, not helped by difficult policies on maternity leave, no joint postings, no part-time work, no job shares. It was quite a grind, really, for those concerned. And it was a job designed by and run by men for men with wives. Things, I think, accelerated in the last decade, not least when the women themselves took a bit more of a hand in trying to shape and design this, lobbying for greater participation of women in selection and promotion panels, running talks and networks and mentorship to try and raise the ambition of the women who had increasingly been able to join the diplomatic service, but were not rising as far or as fast as they probably should have done relative to their male counterparts. And we brought in those important things of more flexible working, different styles, And obviously society was moving in parallel with this in terms of greater communications, digital internet and so on, and the ability to work remotely, making it physically possible to raise a family and rise to senior office. Not easy, but possible. So I was the only female entrant in my year in 1974, but by 2020, women were almost 50% of the DS and 40% of the fast stream, which was an accelerated promotion structure. And now some 30% of our ambassadors are women, and fantastically, because I think this has been a great achievement, all of our ambassadors in the Security Council countries, the P5, and in the G7 countries, the most developed economies, are all women. And that's an extraordinary achievement. So it means that all of our major relationships are being led now or contributed majorly by women. It's not all secured. There are many other things I could tell you about the Foreign Office which don't sort of lead to that same positive conclusion. The executive board has twice as many men as women, and we have not yet had a head of our diplomatic service being a woman. Problems for ethnic minority women can be more difficult still, particularly the intersectional cases. But we have one Black British High Commissioner, Nene, who's in Mozambique. And looking more widely, I think most of the major international organizations are currently run by men, though of course Christine Lagarde was a notable head of the IMF, and Patricia Scotland is Secretary General of the Commonwealth, for example. So I think you could say in the British Foreign Office that we do now have women in very senior positions. And you obviously around the world and in the European Union, President of the Commission and obviously senior leader in Angela Merkel. So there are women out there on that stage. And what, from my experience, has been the impact over the last 5 years or so of more women being involved? Well, I think certainly it has changed the look and the style and the working methods of our organization. And so I think women have strongly led and worked to enhance and improve consular services, which, although has always been a Cinderella area, nevertheless, 60 million British citizens travel abroad each year. And you deal with family reunification, forced marriages, people in trouble, people being held hostage. And it's key for public and media interest and appreciation of what diplomats can do for them. Women have also worked, in my experience, very naturally within the wider people-to-people nature of foreign relations as we now know it. Ministries direct to ministries, experts to experts, explosion of involvement by NGOs and the charities, wide-ranging development, science and higher education cooperation. I've seen women really run with this portfolio, and it's very, very powerful. COP26 will be a massive event, even with COVID, I suspect, this year. And those areas where I think the diplomacy has become more diversified by simply the nature of more communication between these people has been something that I think women have promoted. Women's influence, I think, has also been found in the promotion of gender equality. And gender equality is the fourth most important priority for my Foreign Office at the moment, major plank of our G20 leadership, and that I'm thinking particularly about combating violence against women, domestic or in conflict, securing access to your own reproductive and sexual rights, education for girls, and as you saw, additional money for girls to try and secure 12 years of schooling worldwide was announced at the weekend, and economic empowerment. I'm not trying to overplay this. We still have because of COVID, 650 million at least women out of education, and there's been an avalanche of called the shadow pandemic of gender-based violence. But nevertheless, gender equality is a very important part of foreign policy. And I think to be credible in pursuing this, the foreign services have got to have women themselves there. So a few thoughts before I conclude. I think that in my experience, what have women brought to the party? They can see issues holistically, reflecting their parallel home and family and professional responsibilities. They can be more inclined to find compromise and consensus, reflecting their education and relative physical strength. They can more easily focus on relationships. Diplomacy is a contact sport. They can and are accustomed to listening, and they are supportive of each other. And I think the international female networks have gradually gathered pace And I certainly found that if there was a woman minister in an important area in Mexico, climate change as it happened, and in South Africa on science, we were sisters. We were automatically able to be sisters because of that network. So in conclusion, Karen, and I'll stop, female leadership in international organizations is growing, but not uniformly, and nothing like to represent women in the world. Women diplomats bring skills very relevant to handling difficult global issues on this people-to-people basis. But diversity needs to be wider. And I think people, boys and girls, men and women, need to be educated more consistently to understand the complexity of global challenges and the range of issues. I think it's called global competence in the OECD, but it's about values and it's about international issues and the value of international institutions. So I think that's critical to this path ahead, but I think women can play a major part. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, now on to Roberta. Roberta, over to you.
Thank you, Karen. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay, and I'm going to talk through a slightly more theoretical analysis of this topic. So what I'm going to look at is the issue. Can you all see my screen? If that's okay. Okay. Of gender leadership in diplomacy and foreign affairs. And what I'm really going to focus on is the issue of gender, and I'm going to treat gender as a prism or a lens through which we're going to explore the issues of leadership in the context of external relations and external affairs. And this draws on some work that I'm currently doing on gender and leadership in the context of COVID, as well as gender and leadership in the European External Action Service and European External Affairs. So I'm going to merge some of that work together in this presentation today. What is really interesting to note is that in recent years, there has been a growing interest in the issue of women and leadership, of female leadership. And a number of questions underpin this particular exploration of the issues, mostly because it's been what's been highlighted is the lack of female representation at senior executive levels, both in diplomatic services, external affairs, government, politics, but also economic structures. And a lot of this work has focused predominantly on behavioral traits of leadership, including how women behave in the context of those particular roles. Do they bring something to the table? Do women actually allow us to perform better? And do we have different kind of leadership styles? You might be familiar with the headlines that were quite mainstream during COVID. Do women lead better, and are women better at managing the pandemic? I would contend that this is probably the wrong question, because it pushes the onus of justifying the position of women in leadership position onto those particular individuals. There is an increasing body of work that is demonstrating that is less than, rather than focusing on women as being better leaders in the context of crisis, we should focus on what were the circumstances that enabled women to become political leaders in certain countries, and whether those were the circumstances that allowed those particular countries to manage the pandemic differently. So when we talk about gender and leadership, again, my focus is on the gendered traits of leadership. So I'm starting from the position that leadership is itself an institution, a soft institution, if you wish, or an informal institution, but nevertheless an institution, because it's governed and defined by norms and feeds into structures. And as an institution, I would argue it is both gendered and racialized. And I think we need to really think about those issues both separately and in an intersectional way. Then Judith has already mentioned that when we think about diversity within the context of diplomacy and foreign affairs, gender is only one of the issues that we need to contend with in terms of diversifying our the institutions that are diplomacy and foreign services. So when it comes to gender and leadership, what we see is that gender stereotypes remain prevalent. And these can be seen as sticky issues, because what we are really kind of focusing on is observed role behavior. Now, here the literature is opening up a pathway for debate and discussion relating to you can't be what you can't see. So the kind of symbolic representation, being able to see someone who looks like you, who represents you, performing a certain particular role. However, from political psychology, we know that women's behavioral codes, or rather, people who belong to minoritized groups have a smaller range of behavioral codes that are open to them to perform certain leadership roles and positions. And I think this is quite key, because then it leads to both the vertical as well as the horizontal segregation of leadership roles. So who occupies which positions for how long and what are their pathways. So this is a little bit in terms of context and background. I then want to take you to one of the classic writers of the second wave feminist movement, Simone de Beauvoir. And I think one of this quote really captures something that a number of gender and feminist scholars have highlighted as the problem of looking just solely at women in leadership, right? So what de Beauvoir argued is that it would never occur to a man to write a book on the singular situations of males in humanity. If I was to define myself, I first would say I'm a woman. All other assertions arise from this basic truth. If we take the first bit of this quote, what she highlights is that by studying women in diplomacy, we normalize the position of male and the male norm or masculine norms as driving certain institutions. This is true for when we study voters' behavior. And if we think about the gender gap, we don't study men's voting patterns. We always study women's voting patterns. So we normalize men as the citizen. This matters because it links to identities, representation, and the process of othering. And then I would argue it leads on to relations of power and structures. And here is really the link to institutions. In terms of our key foundations for looking at those kind of things, many of us go back to, again, another classical writer who has informed a lot of gender scholarship in international relations, and that is Cynthia Enloe. And Cynthia Enloe asked one devastatingly simple question: where are the women? And in this context, what she says, counting matters. And so if we think about, going back to one of the comments that then Judith made about the G7s, where are the women? Where were they in terms of the symbolic representations? What roles were they playing over the last week? But then she also asked another equally simple and devastating question: where are the men? It is important to understand where women cluster, where men cluster. And then she asks two significantly deeper questions. Who put them there? What are the pathways for men and women to occupy certain positions within organizations? And last but not least, how are they expected to behave once they are there? In other words, she asked the question about what role is gender playing? So, for Enloe, gender makes the world go round. And I think the two key questions that she asks, and are always at the forefront of some of the work that some scholars in the Gendering EU network are doing at the moment, is where are the women? But then the deeper question: what work is gender doing? Some initial reflections. First of all, when we look at diplomacy and foreign affairs, we can treat them as institutions, and institutions rely on gender categorizations. What that means is that institutions rely on members of the institutions to perform appropriate gender functions within them. This links to what I was saying earlier about the codes of behavior that are open to different groups of people and minoritized groups. And here I would also include women as a minoritized group, not a minority, but a minoritized group as one of those groups. And what that does, it kind of legitimizes sex categorizations, and it means that institutions partake in the construction of social inequalities. And that's often also when we try to address some of those kind of changes. If we don't look at the structure and the nature of the institution, we tend to reproduce those kind of processes and structures. So what we see is that when women enter leadership roles, they face a double bind. On the one hand, gender stereotypes limit the scope of leadership behavioral codes open to women. On the other hand, there is a process of disciplining if women don't adhere to those kind of behavioral codes. So the disciplining performative nature of gender in that context becomes quite key. So let's take a turn, therefore, to look specifically at gender and diplomacy. And I think this is also the interest in this area has grown not just because we're seeing a growth in senior women's representation in the context of diplomacy, but also because we have seen the rise of interest in the women, peace and security agenda, recognition that conflict and foreign affairs are not gender-free and gender-neutral, but they're deeply gendered, especially in relations to gender-based violence, education, and the link between foreign affairs, external trade, and development as part of a broader portfolio. Additionally, in the last 5 years, we've also seen the growth of the feminist foreign policy agenda, with a number of countries making statements and adopting frameworks for developing and embedding a feminist foreign policy. I'm not going to go into that discussion. That's a whole different set of work that we can do, which is hugely interesting, just like the women, peace and security agenda. But I think they're not for today, but they provide a backdrop and a background. Now, in terms of gender leadership in foreign affairs, the work that I think is most cutting edge at the moment is the one produced by Agastam and Towns, Jackie True, Kumshkovka, and Shea. What they're seeing is the shift in patterns of how women enter diplomacy and external affairs. So I'm now going to draw on some of my work with my colleague Laura Chappell, looking at two senior women in a position of external affairs who occupied the same role. So one is Catherine Ashton, and the second one is Federica Mogherini. Both of them are HR VPs, so high representatives and vice presidents for the European External Action Service. These are looking at their position within the European architecture, and especially their positioning within the European External Action Service as not just the first HRVP in the case of Catherine Ashton, but also the first two HRVPs, both being women, and having seen the growth of the EU promoting women, peace and security and external affairs, makes them really interesting case studies, if you wish. And what we noticed by looking at their speeches, so we're looking at Ashton and Mogherini as gender actors themselves, so women in leadership position who may not necessarily see themselves as feminists or position themselves as advocating a feminist agenda. What did they do, and how did they understand their role as senior women in leadership position? And what we're seeing is a very liberal approach. So some of us would call an add women and stir approach, assuming that by bringing women into the fold, it will actually address structures of power. So a lot of focus on employment, inclusion in decision-making, and mentoring. Mentoring is one of the underlying kind of themes that comes through a lot of the work that we're seeing on gender and leadership. Just a couple of kind of comments to conclude. And this really is important, because when we look at gender and leadership, we need to look at the position of women as leaders in the context of crises. And if we turn to the body of work from management studies and organization studies, we see that women tend to rise to the position of leadership in context of crisis, when many men find the position itself far too risky for their position and career opportunities. This is what has come to be framed as the glass cliff. If you wish, looking at the context of Brexit and the UK, something that I've researched, Theresa May is often now cited as an example of the glass cliff, of a woman rising to a position of prominence and leadership in the context of crisis. So a couple of conclusions, which come from the literature and some of my broader observations. A lot of the work that has been done that focuses on the Add Women and Stir approach, or those kind of strategies for increasing female participation in diplomacy and foreign affairs, draws on, if you wish, the lean-in kind of approaches. But this really obfuscates the gender nature of leadership as an institution and how it's performed. Often what we're seeing in terms of strategy is the introduction of mentorship. If we mentor women through the career process, they're more likely to succeed. However, the evidence on that is actually quite mixed. What we're finding is that sponsorship, and often sponsorship by a member of the dominant group, so in the context of diplomacy, especially in advanced industrialized economies and the global north, white men, senior white men, is much more effective than mentorship. So pathways to senior leadership for women are increasing, but they're still seen as exceptional. So we have a lot of discourses around the issue of exceptionalism. Finally, a note of caution. What we're also seeing rising through in terms of increasing women's representation in the context of leadership role in external affairs is this notion that women create better peace in the context of the women, peace, and security agenda. Women are more effective at handling the interactions between people, so the softer side of diplomacy. There is a danger attached to that, which is essentializing women's position and women's roles. It also assumes that that is the reason why we need to have more women in decision-making structures and processes, and therefore overshadows issues to do with social justice, representation, and inclusion. So those are some of the kind of key trends in the literature and some of the work that is currently taking place. And I hope you find it useful as a snapshot into gender analysis of leadership in diplomacy and external affairs. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Right, thanks, Roberta. Over to Henriette. You're on mute still.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so let me very briefly share my screen. And of course, many of the points have already been mentioned, so I really try to keep it very brief. So thank you very much, Judith and Roberta, already for bringing us on the topic. And of course, it has been pointed out that we have, of course, many more women leaders on the rise over the past couple of years, whether we look at international organizations or the European Union in particular, or also, as was pointed out by Roberta, with regard to the recent COVID-19 pandemic, whether women lead differently or not. It's a continued discussion. But if we look at the bleak numbers, and of course we should not limit our discussion on the numbers only, like from UN Women of 2020, we see that women heads of government and state are still only present in 22 countries, that on average women ministers make only up for about 22% around the world. And of course, there are huge differences across the world, and the most commonly held portfolio is also still family and children use. And this has been pointed out by Roberta as well, that these are the considered more feminine portfolios or soft portfolios as well. So where does it leave us? Yeah, of course, women face more hurdles in accessing leadership positions to this very day. But here also sometimes really the devil sits in the detail. If we think of the European Parliament, for example, within the European Union, it is the utmost advocate for greater gender equality. And for the current term, for example, we have about 40% female legislators. But this does not translate into the leadership positions within the European Parliament. Yeah, so that here they are severely underrepresented when it comes to the positions of president, of vice president, of committee chairs, or party group leaders. Yeah, so we see that from questions of descriptive representation, we cannot neatly, or they do not neatly fit when it comes to the translation into the hierarchical dimension of exercising leadership in a particular institution, and vice versa. Also, when we look to the ministerial level, yeah, so having a Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, once she entered office, she realized that in the Foreign Office, it's severely underrepresented women, and also other, like the questions of diversity. So she launched a policy to actually increase the numbers of women in the foreign ministry history of the US. Yeah, so it's not sufficient, obviously, to look at the numbers exclusively. But in addition to that, we also see a lack of awareness of women leaders and leadership and their contribution. So really adding to this kind of exceptionalism, so only focusing on Hillary Clinton, for example, right? And not actually acknowledging sufficiently the diversity that we actually find of women leaders and their contribution. So they're kind of always tend to be written off the history. And this contributes to this gap that we find empirically. And also we see a narrow perspective on women leaders in politics and economy. Of course, this is the locus of power, but we see many more women leaders in social society or civil society organizations and social movements, etc., that are not sufficiently acknowledged. And also we see a strong focus on women leaders, both with regard to the public and international media, but also with regard to scholarship, still focusing very strongly on the US and Europe. And this, again, also from the scholarly perspective, tends to narrow our perspective as well. Now, moving on from there, I just want to briefly touch upon, also for the sake of time, so that we have more time for conversation as well, on the exercise of leadership and this particular question whether women would lead differently from men. And I just want to build on a recent research that I have conducted together with Pamela Pansari. And here we investigated charisma and rhetoric at the example of the European Commission and the European Commission members, all of them between 1999 and 2019. And so we assume that there are no principal differences between women and men in their leadership performances. And here we build also on the scholarship of other scholars such as Alice Eagley, but that women leaders are more exposed to the double bind that was also already pointed out by Roberta regarding stereotypes about gender. And we find that men and women use both socially constructed feminine and masculine norms and connotations in public speech making. So they both cut across these so-called gender divides in leadership performances, but that women tend to incorporate a stronger variance. So they have a broader variance of speech patterns. And so they come actually as the more skilled speakers in the comparison here within the European Commission. And so we base this, we would argue that women leaders are more subject to severe selection processes and continue to be so, and intense public and professional scrutiny. But those women who end up at the very top positions tend to perform extremely well. And they very often practice a combined leadership style, combining so-called feminine and masculine leadership patterns or patterns of performance. And here, like kind of being both assertive and conciliatory at the same time, or among others. But here I would like to emphasize that also men who employ this more combined, this more complex leadership style are also more successful. If we look at the predecessors of Ursula von der Leyen in the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker and José Manuel Barroso, Barroso was much more assertive and top-down. And Juncker also employed a more kind of combined leadership style, yeah, catering toward the audiences, but also being assertive at the same time. So here also men, of course, employ the style and are then also more successful. And so for modern democracies, given the kind of the difficult or wicked problems that they face, it increasingly requires a more inclusive and combined leadership style to actually address these complex problems. And I would argue perhaps that moving beyond these dichotomies, that are social constructions in any case, it might also be fertile in new diplomacy and in face of contemporary global challenges. And I would suggest to stop here, right, for the sake of time, so that we have more time for conversation. So yeah, thank you very much. And I look forward to our discussion.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks to all of our panelists. As has already been said in the chat, you can put questions in the Q&A. And I'll take a selection of them and address them to the panelists. There are no questions yet. So I think I will open a discussion just, I think, starting with the phrase, Henriette, that you had right at the bottom of the last slide on how women could help with these why they would be so fertile in terms of dealing successfully with some of these new diplomatic challenges than say other people. I guess that kind of does come back to that stereotypical view that women leaders did better during the pandemic. Basically Jacinda Ardern, I think, is the one that they mostly point to. Close off your country. So I just, I'll come back first to Judith. I'll go in the order then. What the prospects are, basically, for women-led diplomacy in this new world order with these new issues we're dealing with.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks, Roberta and Henriette. It was great. I mean, I think maybe this is a question of how we're using language as well. It's certainly in the UK experience. We've had women head of NATO delegations. We've had 2 women running our intelligence agencies. Our premier police commissioner is a woman. And basically, we've had sort of increases in our military forces as well. So and actually I can recall that in the sort of the counterterrorism and the intelligence-based areas of the Foreign Office, there were always a lot of women. So I don't think it's been actually that they've always done touchy-feely female subjects. What I think they may have done, actually, and coming back to Henriette's point, is I think they have rather skillfully blended, as it were, the female attributes, the sort of the personal, if we're not stereotyping by saying this, because not everybody is like this, but nevertheless, that ability to very much focus in on relationships, while at the same time, obviously, handling difficult, hard subjects, if you like, in often crisis situations and conflict situations. It doesn't surprise me, and I think I said the same thing, but differently, that female public speakers and politicians, we're blending politicians and diplomats here, and that's a bit dangerous because they're quite different. But in their speeches, they may be coming across as more inclusive, more empathetic, while nevertheless making some hard-hitting and politically seeking popularity approaches. That seems to me to chime with what I've observed, which is this different style of diplomacy. We don't all sit around talking about conflict in smoke-filled rooms. It is so much more project-based. It is so much more diverse in terms of the subject matter that one is dealing with. And I feel that many of those issues have become social issues, so development par excellence, and the particular primacy that's been given to women as actors in terms of economic empowerment, for example, in development work. In higher education, science policy, well, we could do with more women professors and more women researchers, but there are a lot of women around, and that has not been an issue that's necessarily curtailed or facilitated, but it's something in which women have participated on a fairly equal basis. So I think that there is something in this that the modern, if you like, or the future even approach to better relationships between states will require, as a diplomat would tell you, understanding other people's language and getting onto the same platform as them so that you can have a conversation on a level. Because if you try to do it from a position of superiority or inferiority, your negotiation is already, as it were, going nowhere. So I recognize some of the things, many of the things my colleagues have said, but I think in reality, there probably are more examples and more things. I was thinking of, the COVID pandemic. Margaret Chan, of course, led the WHO at the time of the Ebola crisis and did it brilliantly. So it's actually one point none of us have said, which is, I think the important thing for this is to ensure that not only are there exceptional women doing exceptional things, and we've had the 2 EU examples, but that there are people immediately behind them who will step into their shoes, that there is this succession, that there is this pipeline. And that is my worry sometimes. It takes so long for people to get up to the top that they don't always have the time to do the mentoring and the sponsorship, but it's very critical.
Great, thank you. From the coal face, as it were, of diplomacy. Roberta, any thoughts?
Yes, thank you. And I really value that contribution, Dame Judith, because it is, as you said, Karen, from the coal face and from real life experience. But it's one of the things that I would draw attention to, and I don't have the statistics to hand in terms of diplomatic services, but the fact that we take notice and we know who the women are in senior leadership position, really goes to show how few and far in between they are, because it's still quite an exceptional, not just an exceptional individual who reaches that position, but it is still quite exceptional to see that, despite the growth in terms of this kind of cohort effect that we've seen in the last 5 years. You raised the issue of the pipeline. And you're absolutely right. And that is really where it's quite significant. So I did some work with, again, my colleague Laura Chappell, looking at the gender regime of the European External Action Service. And what we found, we mapped where the women were across the whole of the institutions, not just the senior level positions. Because when we examined that, of course, there was Federica Mogherini as the HR VP, but also Helga Schmidt as essentially the number 2 in the European External Action Service. But then we saw a dearth of women in senior to middle management position. There were women, but mostly in clerical roles. So we see the kind of both vertical and horizontal there, then segregation of the institution, which then led us to really think about the institution itself and its own gender regime and how that affects the possibility for different individuals to work their way through the pipeline. So these kind of very basic HR issues and diversity and inclusion issues remain really present and really significant in terms of the next step. But yeah, no, thank you.
The pipeline is always an issue. I was just thinking about the pipeline into senior academic positions, and how long a haul that is to increase the supply, as it were, going through a pipeline. It starts basically with secondary school and on up, and so you're talking decades kind of preparation. But anyway, over to you, Henriette. I don't know if you have any views on your own
no, thank you
on your own slide.
Yeah, on the regarding the pipeline, I mean, it's very interesting. The European Commission started to promote greater gender equality policies within its own ranks in the early 1990s already, and it took until 2019 to reach 42% of female director generals. So it really shows you this long-term process that it takes. And also when we look at Hillary Clinton, I mean, she's the second Secretary of State for the US, right? Before that, we had already Madeleine Albright. We have a long tradition of female security advisors with Jean Kirkpatrick, for example, but also with Condoleezza Rice. And so it took until Hillary Clinton to really increase the numbers within the Foreign Service as well, substantially, like to put it on top of the agenda and to press for that, because and there it shows you also with these women the strong diversity. I mean, here you have also very assertive women leaders when it comes to foreign and security policy. Condoleezza Rice, who kind of developed the preemptive strike policy in the US, for foreign policy and defense policy purposes. So this is not really like, as what Roberta pointed out with regard to this kind of feminine being the peace angels or whatever, this kind of stereotype, right? But really also doing kind of the hard business, so to speak, let's say, of foreign policy and security policy. And this shows you again this kind of cutting across these so-called gender stereotypes in terms of performances, that they might actually not necessarily be helpful, but they confine both women and men in terms of their leadership performances, and they cut across anyway. They go across anyway of these performances, as has been shown by many studies, actually, not just the one on the European Commission. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks. We do have a question which hasn't come through the Q&A, but this is a question for everyone. So, well, two questions. Can we talk about women leadership without referring to individual cases? So Hillary Clinton or Ursula von der Leyen and so on and so on, or is there a general things that we can say about women leadership? And then second question, what matters more in terms of performance? The context in which they operate, or individuals, them as individuals? And I mean, this is the classic kind of, is it the structure, is it agency that matters more in terms of performance? But shall we go in the same order? So Judith, do you want to go try these questions first?
I mean, I think we can, but I think if you were talking about leadership with men, you might well also sort of exemplify different styles of leadership by quoting men. But I think Roberta's spot on, you know, that we can remember the names of the women because there aren't so many of them, and they stick in our memories, therefore, or they catch our attention, and they certainly capture media attention. And glass cliffs and sort of glass slides or whatever, since women don't always prosper in those situations, you know, it's true. I think what one can very usefully, I think, and we've talked a bit about the pipeline, is say that I think there are, you know, there are general things that still apply to politicians, to bankers, to academics, and to women in diplomacy, which is that the policies inside the organization need to be welcoming and geared for diverse membership of their organizations. So, you know, that perhaps these days doesn't seem quite so revolutionary, but 10 years ago, it was a big deal to job share. It was a big deal to remote work. It was a big deal to take out unpaid leave for up to 5 years, and then come back and still expect to be, you know, on a fast track to leadership. And one notices that you know, it's taken much longer in the UK for the political system and parliament, for example, or the banking systems or whatever, to actually adjust and to be working on these promotion campaigns for women. And Karen, you're right. I mean, the academic side is still a tragedy, isn't it, really? I mean, you know, sort of, it's worse intersectionally, because if you bring race into the equation, it really is extremely sort of remarkably undiverse and unequal. But still, you know, sort of the numbers of senior white male professors is remarkably high compared to the women, twice as many, 3 times as many in some instances and in some disciplines. So, and that I think is often because actually the organizations haven't necessarily thought to themselves, we want to be as diverse, what's really holding people back, what are the things that we can do? And the women, as I say, in the Foreign Office helped to force that debate and force change in policy. Because by that time, the public sector wanted to be seen as forward-looking, and there was the Equal Opportunities Act and so on. But the women themselves have to be inspired and also to sort of want to do this stuff. And that isn't always self-evident. And I can remember long debates of people saying, you know, I'm damned if I'm going to go on my BlackBerry all evening just to contribute to this debate for the paper that's going to the minister tomorrow morning, because I've got the kids to feed and I've got other stuff to do. And, you know, one sympathized, but you had to change the modus operandi and make sure that sort of the debate wasn't important at 11 p.m. If the debate at 11 p.m. was still important, you had to join it if you wanted to get your views across. So obviously, in a far-sighted way, change the debate so you don't have to go to these ridiculous, like close Parliament earlier, as has happened. You know, I used to go to debates at 2 a.m. when I was a junior diplomat. Ridiculous. Only about 4 people in the House of Commons. So, you know, it's a question of the women themselves empowering, taking risks, pushing the boundaries, because, and that's not just women, that's all underprivileged people. It's also a question of the organization being made to, or choosing to, or offering to really be more fluid and more diverse. And then I think you start to have a much more open playing field. And as we've seen, you will get many, many more categories. So disabled, you will get the gender, the sexual persuasion issues coming forward. You will get people being more honest, more candid about the ways in which they want to be leaders and can be leaders. And that would be a very, very big advance, I think, for better diplomacy, better management of relationships, because what will work well in a society, I believe, will probably work well internationally between nations.
Indeed, indeed. Roberta, did you want to tackle these questions?
Just very quickly. I think you need to do both, and the way that I would do it is what I did in my presentation. I focus on gender both as a prism and as a structure, and that allows us to change the focus of our attention from the few women who actually managed to achieve leadership positions to the organizations and the structures within the organizations that might prevent success amongst minoritized groups. The only other thing that I would say is that in terms of change, the importance of critical mass. And we can disagree and we can have a discussion about what that magic figure is. But we do know that there is strength in numbers and there is less risk attached to each individual who is advocating for something different if they're not the only woman or the only person of color or the only LGBT individual within a room, right? So there is strength within actually having larger or more diverse representation. And I think that's probably the way forward in terms of thinking about this complex issue.
Great, thanks. Henriette, the last word is yours.
Just very briefly, perhaps on the context versus structure and agency again. I think this question also stems very strongly from the development of social sciences. When we look in the 1980s and 1990s, the focus was very strongly on structures, on institutions and institutionalism. And now the pendulum is kind of swinging into the other direction again. So really focusing more on agency again, and also like kind of leadership studies gaining traction in this regard, because we need to think these two sides together, and it's not either or necessarily. And for the and I stop here. So that's wonderful. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you very much. So we've reached the end of the 50 minutes that we were allotted. I'd like to thank all of the attendees for bearing with us, and especially to the panelists. It's been a very exciting, I think, an interesting conversation that will obviously continue for a very long time in the future. So thank you all very much, and I hope you have a good afternoon.
Yes.
Bye.
Thank you, Karen, for chairing. And thank you, Julia and Jess and Sarah.
Yes, bye, Roberta. Bye, Henriette.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.